Hello, Team Idiot. Last night I was reading a little bit from Emile Durkheim's Suicide, a title that feels as stark and unsettling now as it must have when it was first published in 1897. In his chapter on anomie, he describes modern life as if it were a sort of flickering light, not fully out but not steady either, disoriented, untethered, restless. In his time, he saw this condition in the figure of the bachelor, a relatively new archetype in the 1890s. A man living in an urban environment without a shared story to anchor him to self, to his surroundings, and least of all to others. Reading Durkheim's turn of the century words, it struck me that this idea of a sort of painfully dysregulated ADHD at every level anomie, this is Durkheim's word for this feeling, isn't just about the bachelor, it's kind of a mirror for many, if not all of us at the moment.
If you are the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, means I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, then mine must be the shame. You want it darker, we kill the flame.
But let me read to you about the bachelor, first of all, single man of a certain age, whom I prefer, as you know, just to call the idiot. This is Durkheim's description of the bachelor. He dreams of the impossible. He thirsts for the non-existent. New hopes are perpetually awakened in him, only to be dashed, leaving behind a residue of weariness and disillusionment. Desire in this condition is unmoored. It cannot find a fixed point because it doubts its ability to hold on to what it momentarily attracts. Just as this person makes no definitive gift of himself, he holds no definitive claim to anything in return. The uncertainty of his future, compounded by his own lack of self-definition, condemns him to a life of constant flux. The outcome of this restless instability, this ceaseless agitation and discontent, is an ever-deepening vulnerability to despair, an inexorable slide towards the possibilities of suicide.
Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name. Vilified, crucified in the human frame. A million candles burning for the help that never came. You want it darker. Hey, nay, nay, nay. I'm ready, my lord.
Suicide, of course, is a very alarmist kind of word, you know, one of those sort of gory, grisly, taboo words from the horror lexicon to be used alongside murder, slaughter, massacre, carnage. If you speak to mental health practitioners about your suffering, they will most likely ask you if you are feeling suicidal and to what degree. But as the number of us who actually go through with self-murder or self-slaughter is at most about 20 in 100,000, I think it's wrong, well, it's the wrong word to focus on here. A more honest word might be that of despair. When I speak to men of various ages in my role as a therapist, and when I look into my own heart and soul, what I find there is a good amount of despair, which may of course have certain suicidal ideations, but these are really just ripples on the surface of a much deeper and more turbulent clash of currents. Currents which in Durkheim's understanding essentially boils down to a loss of meaning and belonging. For the meaning side of things, Durkheim uses the word regulation, which is to say the social structures that limit and guide our behavior in ways that anchor us and give us a narrative, a thread through which to live and make sense of ourselves. Whereas integration refers to our sense of connection and shared purpose within different communities. The YouTube ecosystem, I think, illustrates this problem or point well. Participation in content creation, combined with the feedback mechanisms of likes and subscriptions, is ostensibly designed to promote both integration and regulation. If we play by the rules, whatever that means, presumably appeasing the SEO algorithm whose edicts, much like those of the ancient gods, remain opaque, ever-changing, inherently transactional. If we do this while also prioritizing, the cultivation of virtual connections and community, like and subscribe, etc., we are told that this will bring us closer to discovering some semblance of fulfillment, both here and in the broader social landscape. Of course, this landscape, like all others, has now almost fully transformed itself into an entirely virtual social mediascape. But as long as we dutifully prioritize virtual integration and regulation, virtual belonging, virtual meaning in our content creation, the utopian promise of visibility and validation will supposedly materialize, as in you too, fellow idiot, fellow citizen of this realm, can achieve relevance, connection, and meaning if you do this as a social agent. A lot of this has got to do with the ideology of psychotherapy, I think. We might say, at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th, two explanatory frameworks were kind of duking it out in order to understand why a lot of people were feeling so essentially fucked over, if you like, by modernity, even though living conditions, wages, life expectancy, public health, access to education, urban infrastructure, leisure opportunities, etc., had all improved significantly up to this point. So Freud comes along and basically says, forget about society, it's us as individuals and family systems when it comes to explaining our fucked upness, essentially. They fuck you up, your mum and dad, they may not mean to, but they do, they fill you with the thoughts, etc., right? It all starts and ends for Freud, and I would say for the majority of current mental health practitioners, in infancy and early childhood, with our fears, anxieties, frustrations, loves, and hatreds engendered in the individual by the family environment in terms of eliminatory processes, weaning, sex education, sibling rivalry, rejection by one's parents, or alternatively, over-acceptance by one's parents, degrees of dependence, independence, excessive mother love, or deprivation of mother love, father rejection, father domination, overindulgence, inconsistent boundaries, emotional invalidation, and all the other litany of sins guaranteed to keep us therapists in business forever. Ka-ching. Although Freud did acknowledge the influence of social structures to some extent, especially in later works like Civilization and Its Discontents, where he critiques the repressions and frustrations, the discontents imposed by civilization. Still, his framework largely revolved around the intrapsychic, the sort of the stuff going on inside us metaphysically, our unconscious drives, our internal conflicts, our personal histories, rather than any societal failures per se. So basically, at a moral level, according to Freud, it's all your fault, or your parents' fault, and the only answer is inner work. The inner human needs to be worked on, ideally alongside a therapist, charging you anything up to $200 or beyond for 50 minutes. And, once you've done enough work on yourself, you will then, and only then, become palatable for others and for society. You will be able to get with the program, as it were, and, as Freud would put it, handle the common unhappiness that defines the human condition rather than being perpetually overwhelmed by neurotic misery, aka despair. What I am so grateful to Durkheim for, thank you, Emile Durkheim, as well as, the nascent discipline of sociology, which his text on suicide almost single-handedly sort of births into being, is showing us that despair, a word whose etymology simply means without hope, whether it leads to self-murder or just another subjectively shitty day, is really a profoundly social phenomenon. Men in our current age are 3 times more likely to kill themselves than women, as Durkheim also noticed back then, due to being, us men, much less integrated and regulated than our female counterparts. Men, simply put, have less belonging and less meaning in their lives overall than women do, while unmarried middle-aged men, like yours truly, are 4 or 5 times more likely to exterminate themselves than the more or better socialized female sex. But don't worry, virtual citizens of the internet. This isn't a suicide note. It is just a slightly despairing one.
I'm sorry. That sounds awful.
Yeah, well, what are you gonna do? Life's a bitch and then you die, right?
Sometimes. Sometimes life's a bitch and then you keep living.
Yeah.
But it's a nice night, huh?
Yeah.
There's a lover
This is
in the
nice.
story, but the story's still the same. There's a lullaby for suffering and a paradox to blame. But it's written in the scriptures and it's not some idle claim. You want it darker? We kill the flame. They're lining up the prisoners and the guards are taking aim. I struggled with some demons, they were middle class and tame. I didn't know I had permission to murder and to maim. You want it darker? Hey, nay, 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 nay. I'm ready, my lord.